pandemic and continued need for social distancing. In this virtual format, you'll still be able to ask a question of the author if you'd like. To do so, just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screens. And in the chat column, you'll find a link for purchasing this evening's featured book, Life of a Klansman by Edward Ball. We have what I think you'll find will be a very compelling and provocative program this evening, centered around Edward Ball's revealing new book, Life of a Klansman. Edward is a one-time journalist turned author who, as one reviewer put it, has devoted much of his literary career to illuminating history many would rather forget. This started with his National Book Award winning work in 1998, Slaves in the Family, for which he tracked down descendants of those who had once been enslaved by his South Carolina ancestors. Several subsequent books of narrative nonfiction by Edward also dealt with large historical subjects while focusing on individual characters. With Life of a Klansman, Edward returns to his family's history and pieces together the shameful story of a racist great-great-grandfather who took part in the reestablishment of white supremacy in New Orleans after the Civil War. The ancestor, resentful, unsuccessful carpenter, was a rather unremarkable figure in his time and far from a major player in the movement that resisted Reconstruction efforts. But he was an anti-Black militant who fought for what was then called the White League and participated in at least one bloody street insurrection. As such, his story provides a glimpse into the foot soldier ranks that populated early racist movements, and it carries particular resonance today as our country continues to confront racist violence and ideology. Indeed, as Edward calculates in his prologue, half of all white Americans have a family link to a Klansman, but most don't realize it. What Edward has done powerfully in his new book is claim this difficult past, show it can be done, reckon publicly with this legacy of white supremacy, and try to learn from it. Now, Edward will be in conversation with someone who himself has written eloquently and authoritatively about racism and also about anti-racism, Ibram Kendi, a humanities professor now at Boston University and founding director there of the Center for Anti-Racist Research. Ibram is the author of several seminal best-selling books, including Stamped from the Beginning, which traced the history of racist ideas in America and won the National Book Award for Nonfiction 4 years ago, and How to Be an Anti-Racist, a probing and personal work that challenges us to rethink our views of race, re-examine policies and institutions, and reimagine a more just and equitable society. So Edward and Ibram, the screen is yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Bradley. And Edward, it's truly an honor for me to be in conversation with you. I was, mentioning with you backstage or the virtual backstage about how I'm actually excited to be the one asking the questions tonight. And so I'm gonna sit back and sort of really want to learn more from you about this text, which I was, of course, excited to read, Life of a Klansman. And of course, I'd like to encourage everyone to ensure that you just don't listen to our conversation, but it really be a stepping point to getting the book and diving into the book. And so, Edward, throughout your career, you've been, a riveting storyteller and chronicler of history. And, the book oftentimes reads like a novel. And so I don't want to ask questions that can give away the story. It's certainly a story that every American should know. It's a history that every American should know, and so every American is going to need to read the book for that. But I want to discuss other things about the book, if that's okay. And so first, every book has an origin story, and so I'd love to hear about the origin story of this book. How did this book sort of come to be in your mind?
Right. Well, thank you, Ibram. It started more than 10 years ago. I had inherited the family notes of an elderly aunt from New Orleans. And browsing them, these were genealogical notes. You know, every family has a family historian, and this woman named Maud LeCorne was our family historian in my mother's family in New Orleans. She had died, and I found in her folders the story of our Klansman. And I had remembered from childhood hearing about him. My grandfather, she would say, was a redeemer. He helped to restore white people to authority here in Louisiana when the world was turned upside down during Reconstruction. Remember him, Constant Lecorne. And so it was more than 10 years ago, I began to look at this subject and tell the story to myself. I tried to write a novel about our Klansmen. And I wrote about 100 pages, and they were crap. So I put them aside, and then the eruption of white supremacist violence was renewed in this country 5 years ago with the so-called Charleston massacre at Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, and the killing of Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown and Tamir Rice and Alton Sterling and Freddie Gray. And it was maybe 5 years ago, I said to myself, I'd like to tell this man's story as a piece of nonfiction because it is emblematic of the spread of white supremacist ideology into the families of ordinary people.
And so, you know, on its face, this book seems to be written somewhat in the spirit of course, your National Book Award-winning book, Slaves in the Family. But then again, as you read it, in this book, almost the present seems to be the staging ground, and then you go searching into the Ku Klux Klan past, while with Slaves in the Family, it seems to be quite the opposite. The slaveholding past seems to be the staging ground, and you go searching up to the present. Would you sort of, to think about the relationship between those two books, is that an accurate way to sort of understand it, and even the relationship between these two books and yourself and even your family?
Yes, I think that family history is kind of a stepchild in history, the scholarly discipline. And I want to use family history as a way of entering the historical real through the channel of the personal. And I believe that all of us, you know, have capital history written, inscribed in our family trees if we look for it. So you're right. I reached back from the present to retrieve this distant ancestor in order to tell a story about the construction of white racial identity, if you would permit me to use a kind of academic term. And in Slaves in the Family, which is 20 years old now, I reached into the past in order to move forward towards the present to find African-American families whose ancestors our family had once enslaved. This book, Life of a Klansman, tells stories from my mother's family in Louisiana. Slaves in the Family tells stories from my father's family in South Carolina. So they are like two ends of a bracket, I suppose.
No, that makes sense. And what's fascinating is, you know, even when you talked about sort of urging people and even writing in a way that the individual, the person can sort of think about their relationship to history. And you know, at one point in your book, you write, our Klansman was my grandmother's grandfather. And throughout the book, and even so far during this talk, you've referred to him as our and my, and you seem to use these terms, very deliberately throughout the text. Why was that so important?
Well, I think it's useful to take ownership of a difficult past rather than to deflect and disparage or disavow it. The common response about the difficult subplots in American history is, oh, those weren't my people. We weren't involved with that. My people didn't enslave Black folks. Don't talk to me about that. Whereas the reality is, if you look even carelessly, you can find one's own family history is full of all kinds of misbegotten and sometimes cruel behaviors. As Bradley said at the beginning of our conversation, I calculate that 1 out of 2 white Americans has a Klansman in their family tree. If they would like to look for them, they would find them without too much difficulty. So I think that it's helpful, almost like medicine, to try to take ownership of the hard parts of American history. And in this time, as everyone knows, this summer, we are undertaking a new step in reckoning with our racial history in the streets and in reconsidering the monuments that we have erected to formerly heroic individuals. And so that's another kind of taking ownership, I think.
Definitely. And yeah, you actually write in your prologue that 1/2 of whites in the United States could, if they wished, write a Klan family memoir. So would you actually encourage your fellow white Americans to do so? They may not be able to get it published, but I mean,
right.
Even with my book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, what I want for people is to be able to even reflect on their own sort of racial ideas. I mean, would you think white Americans should similarly, think about chronicling their own families' potential Klan past?
Well, I suggested semi-comically, but at another level, it's not entirely comic, because I think that racial identity and racism is a psychological phenomenon, and family history, if it's undertaken with some care and not in an effort to tell fairy tales about the wondrousness of our predecessors, family history is a way of accessing one's own psychological depths. And I find that the two activities can be combined, history and psychological inquiry. I think that racism is an unconscious phenomenon that is best addressed if you try to disengage it from the depths of the mind. And one way to gain access to that is through family storytelling.
But I think in order for people to do that, in a way, they have to be willing to be vulnerable, be willing to be vulnerable with themselves, be willing to be vulnerable with their families. And so how are you able to be so vulnerable in this text and even in your of course, your previous works?
Well, I think that I wrote this book in the first person with the voice of a narrator who is the first person singular, I, and intentionally as an effort to come to terms with expose myself to the truths and the troubling nature of our shared racial past. And if you like, it's an act that can be replicated by other writers. And so often historians feel prohibited from using the first person when they investigate the past. But I find it's actually a way in to the stories for readers, and it's a highway to the soul.
Yeah, I can certainly attest that some historians have not liked my use.
Use the first person.
But one of the things I reflected on, as I thought about this text, and even your use of sort of family history to with this sort of tell and share, clan family memoir, as you stated, and even your previous, again, your other book we spoke about earlier, which was a slave sort of family memoir. It made me think about in the 19th century how so many freed Black people decided to write slave narratives, right?
Yeah.
And I guess one of the things that I'm wondering is if indeed other white Americans begin to start writing narratives about their Klan past, their slaveholding past, what type of effect could that have on the 21st century, in the way that those slave narratives had, in the 19th century?
Yeah. It would be interesting to speculate. I think the short answer would be it would be a stage in changing the narrative if other families and other individuals began to take accountable ownership for their ancestors' behavior. It would be a stage in changing the narrative, and I would welcome it.
Yeah, it really would be, especially if white Americans were able to even chronicle the accumulated advantages of privilege. So it wasn't just sort of writing about that time, but they could really begin to understand, for instance, how and why there's such a large, for instance, racial wealth gap from the standpoint of their own sort of families. And one person who could write a Klan family memoir is the President of the United States. Could you tell us about that?
Sure. Yes. Well, that probably comes to no one as a surprise.
No.
But in the 1920s, the president's father, Fred C. Trump, was a Klansman in Queens, New York. And this is proved by the fact that he was arrested in 1927 on Memorial Day in a hood and a robe in a Klan march through Queens in a riot that he evidently helped to provoke. So yes, the president is one of the many who could write a Klan family memoir. I did want to write a family history of whiteness, if you like. There are books about what it means to be Black. There are few testaments about what it means to be white. And what I try to do using the form of a parable, telling the story of one individual and his attraction to white supremacist ideology and violence, try to depict how one family is suctioned into a form of racial identity that is malign and dangerous and ends up wounding a lot of people. And of course, they were not the only ones. I mean, there are tens of thousands of other white Southerners who did things like the things that my ancestor did in New Orleans. But it's kind of an origin story for whiteness. What was it? Where was it born? Who were its parents? How did it grow up? And what nourished it? And how did it mature? So I try to make it as substantial and visible, whiteness, as blackness is to white Americans. I try to make whiteness as substantial and visible to white Americans as blackness is to us.
And why did you think that was so important, particularly in this time, in 2020, when so many, particularly white Americans, believe would probably shy away from talking about and highlighting and understanding and describing and historicizing whiteness, and have been taught to be sort of colorblind, that should be the goal.
Yeah. Well, one of the blindnesses of contemporary white society is that we, as white people, typically do not think of ourselves as racial subjects. We believe that race is an identity inhabited by people of color. And what I wanted to try to do was to provide a frame in which, by inference, whites could see themselves as racialized individuals. And that is not an easy thing to do. We have much difficulty seeing our whiteness as a racial identity, but there is such a thing as white racial identity, which is conspicuous to tens of millions of people who are not white, and yet somewhat disguised to whites themselves.
Definitely. So I just want to ask two questions from the actual plot, if I could.
Yes, please.
So one is, your Klansman participates in perhaps one of the most important street battles during the Reconstruction era in New Orleans in 1874. So can you, I don't want to give the story away about what he precisely did and even what happened to him, but if you can just share some about this battle and why it was really so critical and possibly even one of the turning points away from reconstructing America to be a land, particularly the South, to be a land of justice and equity, to the redeeming sort of nature or sort of force of white supremacy that ultimately rose.
Yes, right. Well, the protagonist in my book is a guy called Constant Lecorne, who was a white French Creole New Orleanian and my grandmother's grandfather. And he returns from the Civil War as a Confederate veteran, like 500,000 other white Confederate veterans, an embittered man. And he is a carpenter who sinks into poverty and resentment. He begins to join white supremacist organizations that arise in Louisiana, principally the Knights of the White Camellia, which is a French Creole organization, principally that does night riding and targeted attacks upon politicians, white and black, who worked for the Reconstruction governments, had been set up by Washington after the Civil War. He joins another group called the White League. And in 1874, in September, in New Orleans, this was after 9 years of Reconstruction, during which the occupation government in the Deep South had tried to extend political rights to African Americans, had extended the right to vote to Black men, had allowed numbers of African Americans to serve in positions of power. There is an uprising in the streets of New Orleans, and thousands of White League militants, commandos, confront the Union Army and the local militia, which is an integrated militia to defend the government, and they succeed in overthrowing the government in New Orleans for a period of a couple of weeks. And this event, which was called by proponents of the Lost Cause, it was called the Battle of Liberty Place. I refer to it as the Battle of Canal Street. About 30 people died. My ancestor was beaten in the head and his head split open in this fight. And the importance of it was that it prompted the end of Reconstruction. It triggered the fall of all of the mixed race or integrated governments throughout the Deep South. And by a year later, all of them had been toppled and white authority had been entirely reestablished. It prompts the withdrawal of the Union forces from the South, which then allows the white South to once again reassert its control over the lives of 4 million Black people, and to turn the world, which had been turned upside down in their view, right side up with white people on top. So it's an important pivot point in American history. It's called the redemption in the old vocabulary of the Lost Cause storytellers, because the South, my Aunt Maud would use this word, and unironically, the redemption. My grandfather was a redeemer. He returned the South to its proper order. The South was redeemed by the reassertion of white supremacy. And so that's, it is an important kind of set piece in my book.
What's fascinating is when I think of the term redeem, you know,
yes.
it's
yes.
like, you know, gaining or regaining possession
right.
of something. And it's also oftentimes thinking from a financial standpoint. But when you write about later in the book that about a dozen years later, your ancestor dies, and you write that, you know, he isn't celebrated, and quote, he receives no notice in the newspaper, no obituary, the priest delivers a perfunctory eulogy, but that is all. You also note that he dies in poverty, leaving next to nothing for his widow.
Yeah.
Why did you make it a point to share those details?
Well, he, in a way, is a useful pawn for forces greater than he was. I mean, W.E.B. Du Bois talks about the wage of whiteness, which was paid to the white working man of the South, and is paid today throughout the country to the white working woman and working man of our land. And his principal reward was that he felt that his tribe, and white people are, in many ways, we resemble a tribe. His tribe was restored to its proper place as the carriers of authority and beauty and money, and the recipients of all of the values of life on earth. And his family life was wrecked. He lost everything, and he died in poverty. He was buried in an unmarked grave and forgotten. And so what I've tried to do is to retrieve this one individual and tell his life story as a way of telling the stories of many. I mean, in the professional circles, as you know, this book is referred to as a microhistory because it tells the story of a small person in an effort to tell a larger plot. It's like looking at a tree and seeing the whole tree in a single leaf, and that's what I've tried to do.
And my last question, and then we're going to turn to some of the audience questions. And so please, if you have a question, leave it in the write it in the Q&A box. So you also write very beautifully that the past feels like a comfortable place to make moral judgments, and you continue a paragraph down by stating one value in writing this particular life is to refuse to let the past be a refuge, decline to feel superior to it, to reject feeling good because you are better than the uncountable idiots who are conveniently dead. Please explain.
Yes. I think that there is an easy condescension that many hold towards those who have lived before we do. And we subject the lives of millions to an enormous kind of condescension. And one of the privileges of that attitude enables us to place our own aggressions and unspeakable desires on other people and project them on the dead, to say, this man was a bad seed. He was deceived by the ideology of his day. It's like saying to yourself, if I lived in 1935 Germany, I would not have been a Nazi. No, I would have been with the resistance. And these are convenient, I think, self-delusions, and we flatter ourselves with them. If we truly looked at ourselves as people who lived in the days of this figure, Constant Lecorne, and his aftermath, we might find that I'm speaking of myself now, I might find that I would have been swept up in the racist, how can we say, whirlwind, the racist vortex of that day. I think that that's somewhat more honest.
Yeah, definitely. So, I would like to sort of turn to audience questions, and it seems like a few people are sort of thinking about potentially sort of exploring their own family's history, and folks are wondering how would they even begin to discover or even find a Klansman, in their own family.
Well, first talk to the oldest people in your family and ask them to talk about the oldest people that they knew when they were children. And do that with several elderly members of your family, if you can. And with those interviews, take yourself to a family history source, such as Ancestry, and begin to reconstruct the bits and pieces of the lives of the anonymous predecessors that you have. It's not an impossible task. you know, in this book, it resembled making a mosaic from the public record, you know, from sacramental records, from newspapers, from court records, from tax records. I was able to pick out one piece of a tile and then another piece of a tile, and over a period of time, putting them together to create a story about an individual who was quite modest, who made quite a modest impression on his own life and times. But it can be done. It just takes a little bit of elbow grease.
So someone else sort of rightly sort of points out that, you know, many people may fear being condemned. They can't really change their ancestors. They feel that if they come out and tell this family story that they would be judged and condemned. You know, was that something you were thinking about when you wrote your National Book Award winning book, or even Life of a Klansman?
Well, I haven't felt condemned, really. I felt criticized now and then, but I think that on balance, I have experienced a great deal more therapeutic response and a great deal more of love and acceptance than anything else. I mean, to take a medical metaphor, it's like you have a wound, and we do have a series of very serious national wounds, and they have sealed over, trapping poison within the wound. And by lancing the wound and releasing the poison, you find that you can enable healing for other people. And that's been my experience. So I wouldn't be afraid of being shamed. I think that there's a therapeutic value in telling difficult stories.
Definitely, and there's been quite a few people that are asking how you arrived at the 50% of white Americans today who likely have an ancestor who is a Klansman. So I think that folks should just read the book and find out how you arrived at it, or if you want to explain a little bit more.
Well, in the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan counted at least 4 million members. And it was a Klan that was different from, but continuous with, the Ku Klux Klan in which my predecessor participated in Louisiana. Continuous with. If you count forward from 1925, the 4 million Klan members of 1925 have as their descendants today, 100 years later, their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, by a projection in demography, which is not difficult to undertake, about 137 million descendants, white Americans, all of them, throughout the continent. And that is 1/2 of the white population of the United States. So that's how I came up with that projection.
Okay. And so with this book, and I suspect this is something, you know, people are struggling with as they reflect, you know, on potentially doing something similar, or even thinking about it. That folks are wondering how your other family members, you know, have responded to you writing this book.
Yes, how have they responded? Well, nobody in my family in New Orleans, and I have a good number of family in New Orleans, was particularly eager for me to tell the story of our Klansman.
Mm-hmm.
And yet nobody stood in my way and tried to prevent me from doing that. And I'm still on very good terms with all of them. But, you know, the poet Czesław Miłosz said that when a writer is born into a family, his or her family is lost and condemned to embarrassment and exposure. And because all writers, in one way or another, take their family as source material for their art. And so, you know, we're working through it. But the fact that there were quite a lot of us in the game, if you like, in the game of building white supremacy out of the ruins of the Civil War, is something that we understand and acknowledge. You know, I think that white supremacy is something that had to be built. It had to be built, and it happened in the late 1800s. And kind of an ideological constellation that was shaped and gradually disseminated through the United States. It was not as articulated even during the period of enslavement as it was in later decades, in the late 1800s and the aftermath. So we're doing fine. Thank you for asking.
And someone else asked whether your views on race in any way changed during the process of writing this book.
I confessed that I have become more pessimistic than I was before writing this book. Because I feel like I've done a dive into the white imaginary, the white unconscious. I've come upon it, and I feel I've dived into it in a way. And as I said earlier, I think that whiteness is an identity that lies in the unconscious, and it's something that you know the disciplines of psychology and sociology refer to as implicit bias. I believe that's the term of art. Implicit bias is the implicit association test is a very popular sociological instrument by which social scientists attempt to measure the attitudes and beliefs of people. So I've become a little hardened. My skin has become a little tougher. And we spoke about the redemption several times in this hour. And I feel sometimes that there is little redemption in stories of the kind that I've taken such pains to write, and I wish that it were otherwise.
Yeah. So another question, I'll read verbatim. Thank you for the opportunity to learn from both of you tonight. A question: how can we translate this vulnerability and catharsis of this truth-telling about the past into self-reflection and truth-telling about the present, and individual and collective healing and co-creation of a new and better world?
Well, I think do something small. Try to find out about your own people. Where did they come from? How do they live? What did they get up to? And not the fairy tales about their hard work and their funny habits, but how really did your own family under, insert itself in history. And from that, I think the bigger truths can spill out about how to be in the world. I mean, I do think that to use Ibram, your term, anti-racism, I think that anti-racism is a conscious and purposive and intentional activity. But I suspect that racism is an embedded phenomenon, an unconscious and structural component of psychological life, and that anti-racism will benefit for the more tools, special tools for the self-examination that it requires many of us to do.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, and I constantly am imploring that self-reflection, and is absolutely critical. So another fascinating sort of statement that one of the audience members stated. She, I think, says, "My mother, who is 88, told me this summer that after her father died when she was in college, she went home to help her mother. She found the robe of KKK in her father's bureau. She closed the drawer, never said a word. She didn't know and hasn't found out anything more. Since she participated in the civil rights movement and considers herself woke, there's a lot of shame, I imagine. I'm not sure what to do with this information. What should she do?"
Well, try to look at it straight in the face. I think you would be surprised at the reward, psychologically and for others, the people around you, that you will encounter if you look straight in the face of things like the robe in your grandfather's closet. Mm-hmm. Talk to your mother about it, and write something about it.
So another attendee says, "You seem so calm discussing this." And, actually people oftentimes say the same thing to me. But what kind of emotional process, did you go through, through when delving into this history, into this family history?
Well, I would be fibbing if I said that it was a calm journey. As I said a moment ago, I feel like I've taken a dive into the sharp swamps of our American racial past, and I've found people I know there, and yet I think that the more we remain in a state of disavowal, the more we will remain wounded. And I think that there is a medicinal benefit, and I felt it, of coming to terms with a story like that of my ancestor. And our national history, 400 years of our national history, are full of violence perpetrated against people of color, from head to toe, from coast to coast. It's there to be excavated, and so that's what I've tried to do.
So I think obviously in sharing this story, in a way you had to share the story, of either the sustenance or even the rise of of white supremacist organizing and organizations following the Civil War, and so we're living in a time in which people see a similar sort of growth in white supremacist sort of organizing. And so someone is asking, after studying the sort of history, what do you think are some of the factors that may have fueled the sort of current growth in white supremacist organizing?
Well, I think that white supremacy is like an underground river in our national history. It feeds the roots of institutions. It waters the aquifers of the culture. And occasionally it erupts like a geyser in bursts of violence that lasts for a year or years and then returns to its underground channel, but it never goes away. It's one of the currents of our national life and memory. What has precipitated the waves of supremacist violence? Well, I think that something can be said about a backlash against the Black president who occupied the Oval Office for 8 years. But there are probably other contributing factors, such as the gradual and increasingly rapid pauperization of tens of millions of white working men and women, in the radical upward redistribution of wealth that has occurred in the past 25 years as white working men and women lose their ability to buy and maintain comfortable life for themselves and their children. Their the avenues of grievance and resentment are opened up, and they channel resentment towards other people. But there really has been an explosion of murderous white supremacy in the past. In the past 5 years, about 450 people have died in massacres and mass shootings that are tied to white supremacist ideology. Many of those mass shootings and killings accompanied by manifestos in which the killers openly describe their allegiance to white racial overlordship, and it's one of the epidemics of unfortunately of our generation that it's come back. I believe that it will begin to return to its channel after November 2020, but that will take some effort from all of us to push it back underground.
And so what's fascinating is I think in your explanation, you sort of mentioned the financial loss or even the cost, particularly among white working class Americans, of the growing amounts of economic inequality in this country, but then simultaneously them being told that the cause of their losses were people of color.
Right.
and
yeah.
and it seemed to be the same thing during your ancestors' time.
I think so. Yeah. The bait and switch. The people in power handing an explanation to the underclass for their immiseration. It is almost in harmony with the story that I tell in Life of a Klansman. History doesn't repeat, but it certainly does harmonize. Mm-hmm. And the reality is that those elites of today attempt to deflect aggression and fear among the masses towards a target that they can project their aggression onto. And that's a story told in my book, as well as a story that's unfolding right before our eyes.
And so I think that's what certainly makes this book, Life of a Klansman, so timely. And that's the fascinating, at least when I read it, I felt like I was reading a history from the last 5 years.
Right, history of the present.
Precisely, and
yeah.
And I suspect that's what many people will gather when they read this book. So someone else asked, and I don't know whether you want to share this, but they're actually, they want to know what your next project is, or is there something else you're working on? So after they read this book, Life of a Klansman, what are you going to give them to read next, potentially?
Gosh, I'm working on a few things, or at least that's what I tell my agent, and I haven't quite got the right thing up and running. I told you I tried to write a novel about our Klansmen and failed. So I can't promise that I'm as regular a contributor to the discourse as I would like to be. So I'm going to dodge the question. I'm sorry, Ibram.
And then the final question is, so there's been a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan in our time. And so, someone is asking whether you have been approached or even harassed or trolled in any way, by the current Ku Klux Klan.
Well, the current Ku Klux Klan is not an organized militia as it was for nearly a century in previous generations. It is a largely incompetent and spurious bunch of misfits who get up to very little. But white supremacy has redesigned itself and shifted into the hands of other kinds of militants who are like little cells of activities spotted all around the South and the Northwest. And there is not a kind of national or even a regional leadership that controls their behavior. It is remarkable, though, how these cells of white nationalists and separatists regenerate themselves decade after decade. I mean, a couple of decades ago, the FBI was very successful in prosecuting and dismantling some of the white supremacist groups, such as the Order, which was the murderous group in Colorado and elsewhere in the West in the 1980s. And now they have come back with a vengeance, but they still, these groups take a couple of things directly from the playbook of the old Klan, such as costume and disguise. These groups love to dress up in military fatigues and carry their weapons around and make a show of masculine bravado, almost like the Klansmen themselves, and who love to dress up in their sheets and hoods in order to frighten people. So they use some of the same sort of public tools.
Wow. So Edward, it was great to be in conversation with you about Life of a Klansman. I just want to encourage
Thank you.
everyone to go out and grab this book, and even begin to think about our own family history.
Well, thank you, Ibram. It's my pleasure and honor to spend time with you. I appreciate the invitation and nice to talk.
Of course.
Thanks, Edward and Ibram, for a really thoughtful and insightful discussion. Such a disturbing piece of history, but Edward, your search to expose and understand it is truly inspiring. And just judging from the audience's interest in looking for Klansmen in their own families, you may indeed have studied something.
Yes.
The title of Edward's book is Life of a Klansman. You can get a copy or several by clicking on the link that we've posted in the chat column. And thanks again to everyone for tuning in. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.
Thank you so much, Bradley.
All right. Take care.
Bye.